Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. My sincere apologies for the abrupt cutoff in yesterday's video. It's my aging phone, it is struggling, I should replace it, but it's served me well since 2017 and I have a misplaced sense of loyalty to it. So as long as it can continue recording for maybe a reasonable length of time, I will stand by it. But obviously, if it starts getting silly, then the poor old thing will have to be retired. But anyway, reviewing yesterday's video, I was cut off on a bit of a cliffhanger as the Japanese were mulling over their options. And finishing off on the word however, I'll pick up by saying that US task force is sitting directly across the Japanese line of advance. And by that, I mean their maritime line of advance, because while one column of Japanese soldiers has come by the overland route, another lot are coming with the intention of making an amphibious landing, and that US task force is in their way. That said, the Japanese also have to be aware that the presence of an Allied air unit materially supports the strength of the defenders. And that is another threat that has to be dealt with. So the question is, with very limited resources, this one airstrike that they have to throw in, do they weaken the US naval units in the path of their invasion force? Or do they try bombing the airfields at Port Moresby to try and suppress what's left of the Allied air defences? It's quite a tough choice. Now, given the more immediate nature of the threat, if I were the Japanese, I would throw the attack at the naval units in the hope of weakening them, and just hope that the extra boots on the ground will help them overwhelm Port Moresby's defenders. So they are going to go for it. And so the first thing that happens is that we total up the Allied anti-aircraft defences, which in this case are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, that's quite formidable. The US only needs to land one hit to negate the Japanese airstrike. Let's see what happens. At least the Japanese aren't having to face the AA cruiser. So needing 5s or 6s. Oh yes, that's a very convincing load of flak. So the poor Japanese aviators go in, but in between losses, damaged aircraft, misses, and what have you, the attack is ineffective. Now, what about the Allies? Because they have an air point that they can commit, and they face a similar decision to the Japanese: bomb the invasion force, or save that point for ground support when the land fighting begins. Now, like the Japanese, the Allies, I think, are better off keeping it maritime, because if they bomb and damage the transports carrying those troops, they prevent them from landing. So that is well worth the risk. So they in turn bore in. The Japanese anti-aircraft defences are 3 dice because their destroyers get rounded down. Thank goodness for the weaker Japanese AA. But still, it's good odds in the Japanese favour. And yes, it's a brave attempt, but the Allied aircraft are beaten back as well. So this is going to be decided by a naval battle next. Now, as the Japanese have air superiority, the US player has to declare what units they're committing to sea control. And of course, not unnaturally, they're going to throw everything in. So this forces another decision on the Japanese. Are they going to counter with everything they've got? Or are they going to hold some vessels back for shore bombardment? I think, looking at the Japanese options, now bearing in mind that one of the rules that are in play in this scenario is the optional long lance torpedoes scenario. Long lance torpedoes rule. It's not a bad idea for the Japanese to keep the battleship in reserve as a shore bombardment unit and send the destroyers and the cruisers in to fight the US ships. Now, they are outnumbered, but they do have a significant tactical advantage. So they're going to pair off against their US opposite numbers. And the US destroyers, the excess, will support their cruisers against the Japanese ones. So combat is simultaneous, but for the first round, using the long lance torpedoes rule, the Japanese combat ratings are treated as 2, so that's a pretty formidable punch. I will roll the Japanese attacks first. Heavy cruiser's going to go against the US heavy cruiser over there. Got my surface combat table ready. So its firepower is 2 versus a defensive rating of 9. So I will roll my die and see what we get. A 6. Ouch. So 2 on 9. They needed 4 or better for a hit. So they have scored a hit on the US ship. So that is marked for the moment. And we'll resolve the damage in a sec. Japanese destroyer goes in against the other US cruiser, and it's exactly the same odds. So they need a 4 or better. And they get a hit as well. Oh dear. This is going to be painful. So we'll mark that one too. But hopefully the Japanese won't have it all their own way. The US forces are going to shoot back. Now their combat strength collectively is only 1. And that cruiser and destroyer collectively is only 1. And the defensive strength of the Japanese cruiser is 8. So they still have a reasonable chance. They need a 4 or better to score a hit. Let's see how they do. Oh, 6. Nice. They landed a good one there. And that lone cruiser against the Japanese destroyers similarly needs a 4 or better. No, they don't manage it. So we have 3 damaged units. I'll resolve the damage for the US ship first. Or the US cruiser here, I should say. So they took a surface combat hit. And and you add the firepower of the attacking unit, which unfortunately in this case was 2. Ow. So that's 9 plus 2 for 11, which means the unit is sunk. Goodbye, US cruiser. What about the Japanese one? Oh, that's rather nasty. They paid a price for their victory there. And lastly, the other US cruiser. So that's only 5. Even with the long lance value being added on, that's 7, so it's only damaged. However, it's basically forced from combat, so that will have to reappear at a future date. Now, in theory, it won't reappear because by the time these come back, the game will have ended. It's only one more turn after this one, but at least the Pensacola class cruiser here survived the combat and lives to fight another day. So that just leaves a Japanese destroyer and a US destroyer. Neither side is willing to back down. If the US one runs, the Japanese will have a clear approach to Port Moresby. If the Japanese one breaks off, then their whole invasion has to be scrubbed because they haven't gained sea control. So both sides are going to go for it. Combat ratings are 0 on both sides versus a defense of 8. So this is going to be a roll-off with both sides needing to get a 5 or better. So here we go, red for Japanese, white for US. Nope, misses. They're still going to keep it up. Nope. Oh, tension's mounting. Ooh, then they hit each other. Okay, so that's one hit each. The damage to the Japanese ship, it only damages them, but it forces a break off. And as for the US one, same result. So both destroyer flotillas savage each other and the survivors have to break off. Now, unfortunately for the Allies, that does mean that the Japanese invasion force does have a clear approach. And unfortunately for them, that does mean that this Japanese infantry unit lands to support their friends who've already reached the perimeter of Port Moresby. So we now come to the ground support stage. The Japanese have already committed all their air points to this, but the battleship, which held back from the surface combat, gets to fire, and it gets to employ its combat rating of 2, basically gives it 2 dice, and on a 5 or a 6 it'll score an extra hit in the coming ground battle. So the battleship opens fire, scores 1 hit, that's useful. I'll just mark it. And now we get to the actual ground combat. So there's 4 strength points of infantry on the Japanese side. And there's 2 on the Allied side. Ooh, Allies get 2 hits. And the Japanese get only 1. Okay. Now, the hits you score in this game, as those of you who've seen my previous videos will know, they don't translate directly into hits as such. The attacker actually has to overcome the defender's total. So the effect of the attacker, well, the cumulative effect of the fighting is you add up their hits, and they have to overwhelm the strength points of the defender plus any aircraft that they've got directly supporting them. In this case, it does not. So the defenders of Port Moresby are unharmed, well, largely unharmed, and they are still in this, which does put the Japanese in a bit of an awkward position, because they're going to have to endure an Allied counteroffensive in the coming turn. Now, as that was the only combat for the Japanese turn, I'm just going to go straight to the return to base phase. And I'll move the battle map out of the way. So the battleships have to return all the way up to Kure. Let's just send them steaming back up north for a rest and refit. The surviving US ships return to Pearl Harbor. And the Japanese now get their second deployment phase. This is a tricky one for them because they have strong infantry forces surrounding Port Moresby. But they're in a bit of an awkward place because the Australians are still there and they still have attached air units. The Japanese do have a fair bit of local strength in the area. There's still the garrison at Rabaul, and there's quite a bit of air strength, and they do have some fleet units. Now the question is, do they want to spend any transport or oil points deploying any further units closer to the theatre of operations? And that is a good question because they need to keep an eye on possibly reacting to US moves next turn. They have got their carrier forces in place. So really it may just be a matter of bringing down fresh infantry formations. They might actually do that because the easiest thing would be to get one of these powerful infantry units from Kure and move it, let's see, 4 down to Truk and then another 4 down to Lae. Not that they can manage that. Let's have a look. They have 6 transport points. Okay, they're going to go for a halfway. They will send the 2nd Infantry Division from Kure down to Truk, but they can get it no further than that this turn. And so that brings the Japanese turn to an end for the moment, and it goes over to the United States. It's not been a bad opener for them. It was a well-planned offensive, I think, and it had reasonable chances of success. Unluckily for them, their ground assault just simply wasn't strong enough to carry the day against the Australian defenders. Had it gone according to plan, they would have been sitting very happily on top of one of their critical objectives. But anyway, they'll have to see whether they can maintain their position for another try the coming turn, or maybe confuse the Allies a bit by reorienting themselves and having a go at Guadalcanal instead. That may not work so well, though. They've already committed quite a bit to taking Port Moresby, so we shall have to see. But over to the Allies. As I'd said in the previous video, there's no economic warfare elements to this scenario. And on the first turn, the US don't get a reinforcement phase. Their reinforcements for this turn began placed at Pearl Harbor anyway. So we go straight into their first deployment. Now, the problem for the Allies is that by going only for Port Moresby, the Japanese have slightly wrong-footed them because while the fleet can just about reach Guadalcanal during the operational movement phase, it doesn't quite have the necessary range to get itself all the way to Port Moresby, at least not without facing logistical difficulties. So, what to do? They're going to have to bring some of their fleet units closer, especially following the losses they endured last turn. So looking at their options, it's pretty clear they're going to want to bring their heavy stuff to the party. They'll need the carriers, that's for sure. They'll probably want some battleships too. And definitely the AA cruisers. I'm thinking an ideal task force for them would be the carriers, the AA cruisers, and after their hideous experience last turn, they don't have enough destroyers to go around. Maybe some destroyers. So 2 task forces. But how much is it going to cost to move all of these guys? And will it leave them enough to shuttle around infantry? Also, they need to think about harbours that are big enough to accommodate all their ships. So 1, 2, 3, 3.5 transport points. 4, 5, 6, 7. Just enough room if they deploy to Samoa. But that's still 7.5 transport points. They start the turn with 13. So making the necessary fleet moves will leave them with 5.5. Okay, let's do that. So we bring our 2 US task forces from Pearl Harbor to Samoa. Now the other thing we've got to do is try to beef up the defences of Port Moresby. This is going to be a bit of a tricky one. Because in order to move more infantry into Port Moresby, they're going to have to treat it as an amphibious invasion because it's a contested hex. And the question is who to take, because the nearest infantry unit is the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal. Incidentally, 1 hex deployments. I'll be beefing up the air strength the Allies can bring to the party in this area. That unit, similarly, there's an air unit down in Townsville, but I can't put them into Port Moresby without treating it as an amphibious landing. So more complications for the poor Allies. The only other thing I think I can do is strip Samoa of the New Zealanders. And take the huge risk of sending them to Nomea so that they're in a position to... actually, no, let's send them to Espiritu Santo so that they're in a position to head over to reinforce Port Moresby. So that is, let's see, that's 2 more precious transport points. But I think it leaves the US enough. So we're going to take a bit of a risk with this. What I want to do is have the aircraft carrier task force remain in the area in order, as in this rear area, in order to be able to react to Japanese moves. I'm going to take a huge risk and commit the surface units and the New Zealanders to try and put in a counteroffensive over there. So that's my first deployment phase done with. I'm going to move to the operational phase now. Right, let's go for it. So the battleships put to sea. And a separate force, which I'm very bravely sending unescorted, is going to go from there. Is going to go from Espiritu Santo. Actually, do you know what? I'm going to have to commit the carriers. I've just realized with all those Japanese forces lurking up in Truk, I can't send them in without the carriers. So, yeah, effectively depriving myself of naval cover next turn, but I think we have no choice if we want to hang on to Port Moresby. So those are the Allied moves. And I think we shall leave it at that because I don't want to overextend myself. So, Japanese reactions to this. Unsurprisingly, the Japanese are going to react, but they're going to do so quite cautiously. What we don't want to have is a bit of a disaster, and there's some very heavy units of the US Navy going in. So they're not going to react with the Japanese surface forces at Rabaul. The other problem they have is the Japanese have only got 5.5 oil points. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 4.5. Just sending the carrier task force to sea deprives them of 4.5 of those transport points. So effectively, they've only got the one. So any surface force they send in would be rather hideously outmatched by its US counterparts. So they're going to have to rely on the carrier force in order to secure any kind of naval dominance. It's not brilliant, but it's all they've got to play with at the moment. So let's get that battle board back. And I'll set all the tasks. Oh, hello. Sorry, cat just Pearl Harbored me. Hello, Oscar. Please don't jump all over the board. It's a rather critical moment. Okay, so here we go. Now, first step would normally be the submarine one, but as the Japanese expended both their submarine points on their half of the turn, and the Allies have none, we skip straight past that step. So calculating air points is next. The Allies have 1 locally at the air bases at Port Moresby and another 4 with the carriers, for a total of 5, and the Japanese bring quite a lot. Actually, the Japanese bring 6 air points to the party with their carriers. Their forces, because at Rabaul, their air forces can't do a long-ranged air attack this turn because it's not their half of the turn, so they're on the defensive there. So actually, the Japanese do begin with a slight numerical advantage. Now, mindful of what happened to my camera last time, I'm going to be a little bit careful and I'm going to stop the video here. But we're all set up for the next battle, which is going to be the highlight of the Allied player's turn. Will the relief of Port Moresby prove successful? Will the Japanese be able to hold the Allied reinforcements off? Will a giant cat come along and ruin everybody's plans? It all remains to be seen in the next installment. So I'll just content myself with saying a huge thank you to you guys for following this series so far. I hope you've been enjoying it, and I hope you've had as much fun with this as I have. I will look forward to seeing you again in the very next video, which I hope to be uploading very soon. Do take care, and I'll catch you again for the second Battle of Port Moresby. Thanks again for tuning in, and speak soon. Bye.